Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. And here we are with the latest installment of Interview with the Exorcist. I'm John Barnwell. I'm here in the greater Detroit metropolitan area with Dr. Douglas Gabriel, exploring the massive archives of Rudolf Steiner in an attempt to try and come to a clearer relationship to our world. And since we've been working on this 50 years or so, it brings up some interesting questions, to say the least. And so, given that we got into such deep water last week, I think we're going to have to keep continuing on to give people enough to feast on. And so, with that being said, hello, Douglas.
Howdy. Last
Well,
time, what'd you
when you
call it?
told me what you wanted to talk about, I was like taken aback because it's what we've been working on, really the core of what we've been working on for together for off and on for 45 years or so. And so I can't wait to find out what's at the end of the tunnel.
Well, it's it's funny because that's basically what we're talking about. You know, when the hippies during the Jesus Revolution would come into the coffee shop and they'd overdosed on acid when acid was really acid, LSD, and they'd come in and what would they say? I just met Jesus Christ. He told me to come to you guys because I saw the white light at the end of the tunnel. So here we are, basically pointing out that that's really not that far off. But what happens when somebody goes to the white light at the end of the tunnel? So they're looking at death, something scared them to death, and they feel very humbled and very shameful. But when they get to the white light, what do? Most of the time, the white light says, no, you're here too early. You got to go back. And so basically, that's what we're talking about today. Funny you should bring that up. But yes, last time I was very, very serious because I talked about the Damascus event. And one of my friends called up, speaking to him today, as a matter of fact, and he said, you spoke with such an urgency in you, as if there is an imperative that really people should get going towards what it is that all of anthroposophy is about, which is the wisdom, understanding of the cosmic Christ. And basically, where do we see Christ now? Like I said to every spiritual teacher I ever met when I got into a deep private conversation, where's Christ now? And that then determined really the envelope of their wisdom. And that's the thing that for me, really, I want to make sure people understand that this isn't some I'm not I didn't ride a unicorn down a primrose path when I was a youth to get to this place or to ever be chosen to do the things that I was chosen to do, which in most cases for most of my life I'd always say, well, I haven't made a single choice yet in my life. Everything has been made for me, and it was laid out that, oh, well, I would have to be completely stupid not to just go ahead and do what was laid out there for me to do. So I'm going to describe now, I think you used the term oh, I can't remember. It was a funny term. High, high,
High
weird,
strangeness.
high strangeness, and I'm going to add paradoxical logic, because what I'm about to tell you, you will say is not true. Anyone that with a logical mind, brain bound by the earth through materialism, will immediately say that what I'm going to tell you is complete nonsense. But it is the fact of the matter. It is the fact of initiation. It is the fact that you too can have these experiences. And that, I think, is what my friend Paul was experiencing with this imperativeness that I was expressing last time. And as John just indicated, that we're going into the deepest core of all. Well, I'm going to tell you things today. Don't try this at home. And if you haven't understood in these series of talks, what I'm telling you is a warning. This is not a brag session. This I'm not bragging, and I'm not telling you to do this, and I'm not telling you the way to do it. If I was to meet you and I was to actually encounter you and your aura, then I might say some things to you that I thought might be helpful. Or if I was to read your cards, I might give you some general, what are called characterological disposition advice. Why? Because those things can be read out of the universe. They can be divined. You can get to wisdom through a variety of roads, and you have to choose your own road, your own path. We're all going to the same summit, but the paths up the mountain are infinite. So, what I'm going to tell you was my path. This is not the path you should follow, though I'm certain that as we see in all of these shows, these podcasts, people will say, well, funny you should say that. When I was young, something just very similar to that happened to me. Well, this is because it's now a common experience. So when we talked about the Damascus event, we can't leave it there. You're talking about the second coming of Christ. You're talking about a couple different paths to get to enlightenment. And most people in today's world will tell you they believe in reincarnation and karma and enlightenment. They know nothing about what those words mean, but they believe in it. They, what you sow, you shall reap, and the basic Christian terminology. Yeah, you should love so that you get love back instead of hate. And reincarnation, well, of course, because why? You look around, and a logical mind will see that it is illogical that you come to one life on Earth. Depending upon your birth circumstances, you may be crippled horribly, or you may be born into absolute grace and beauty and loveliness, and have a wonderful life. So then after that, you get judged by somebody, and you either go to heaven or hell, and that's it. No, that's so silly. A child could understand that that isn't true. And karma, well, you don't necessarily see instant karma, but in some cases you do. And the more spiritual you are, the more your karma is instant. It used to be for me when I was working in these realms very actively as a spiritual scientist, I guess you could say, anything I did wrong, any word I said came back to bite me so hard that it would be ridiculous, or anything that I did that was wrong, especially if I knew it was wrong when I was doing it, that was just, "Well, it's going to get me later." Absolutely 100% guaranteed, and usually very quick and with a great vehemence.
There's an old Chinese saying that one learns more from the dragon at the gate than from the horses of instruction. And so it's that whole idea of meeting a challenge. To be able to be a spiritual warrior is basically what we're talking about. And by all means, anybody pursue whatever approach to the realms of divinity that you choose. But I have to be clear that what Douglas and I have been sharing over this long period of time is the path of the spiritual warrior. And, although we joke around a lot, this is not entertainment. And like he says, don't do this at home. There are certain things that you should be very circumspect about because it's not for everybody. And you have to keep in mind that your life is basically played out within the limits of karma, and that to be able to get outside of that kind of loop and the thing that you keep building every time you miss the mark, which sin means to miss the mark, that you didn't find that point of balance. And so you have to redress whatever that is. And Rudolf Steiner was very clear. He said that there are beings that are able to act out of creation from nothingness is the bottom line of what we're discussing. And a being who has accomplished that enlightenment, like the Buddha, is a worthy representative of that light. But Jesus Christ is different. He is that light.
Yes, he's the way. But Buddha did go to Mars to try to tame down the violent, aggressive nature of human beings that come oftentimes are stimulated from that realm of the planet Mars. And so, yes, these different beings are spiritual warriors in some cases. If you think of the Archangel Michael, he's the spiritual warrior of God, the right hand of God, who casts Satan or Lucifer from heaven. And so what John said is right, and I wrote it down and underlined it, spiritual warrior. If you're not a spiritual warrior, don't try to force your way all the way across the threshold. Now, I was just talking with another friend a few minutes ago, and And she's saying, why is this happening? And I said, well, because, Steiner, you're an anthroposophist. We're pulled across the threshold. Your thinking, feeling, and willing go in different directions, and your ego is left there upside down, backwards, and inside out, and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do next. Well, it's really difficult. You better prepare before you get there. And so people are so overwhelmed by the stress of being pulled across the threshold and having to let go of their materialistic attachments and grasping that it rips them to pieces. And so the deal is, if you want to go into the spiritual world, you better be selfless, and you better not try to carry your baggage there. It's not going to work. And it's a process of initiation. And that's what anthroposophy is. And that's what our books, the Gospel of Sophia books, the series, as I've shown them to you before, I'm going to mention a few of these today because I'm going to mention the language of the Spirit, which is in the third volume of the Gospel of Sophia. That's the cosmology, the mechanics, and then the initiation process. So there's different ways to get initiated. Obviously, and I've never said this, I'm certain you've never heard me say this before, but obviously I was initiated in previous incarnations. Obviously. Why? Because I have all the hangover of that, all the bad signs of that, all the good and bad capacities that may come with that. So it's an initiation process. And the Damascus event is one form of initiation, which is instantaneous. It's like a lightning bolt. And it is, for the person experiencing it, the second coming of Christ. The first coming of Christ was, of course, the mystery of Golgotha, the birth, life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ back into the spiritual world. And he went all the way back to the top and then came back down, and he now lives in the etheric realm. And that's where we see him. And so it's called the second coming of Christ. And I'm looking for the quote because Steiner said this many times, and I can't find the quote. John, you're going to have to help me on this one. He said, the second greatest event in human history is the second coming of Christ in the etheric. I can't find that quote. I need it. Below this podcast in the show notes are an article where I took all the quotes about the Damascus event and linked them up to show you what the Damascus event is, because it's absolutely germane, pertinent to our apocalyptic times. It was a quick St. John Revelation, book of Revelation, Apocalypse for Paul. Let's look at Paul for a second, this Damascus event. So make sure to go below and read it, because these quotes are, as John said, this is the core of it all. If you get this, you can instantaneously enter into initiation and the spiritual battle. Because I'm going to tell you in a minute what it was like as a child to have all these things opened up and really have no control over it, because I had no teacher. I had nobody to say, oh, you need to put your shield on. You need to put your mask on over your face before you go outside. You need to do this or that, blah, blah, which I then learned to do from Father William, who taught me all these things. And I was able then to interact with people and not be overwhelmed as an empath, taking on the illness of every person I saw that was ill, which is, hello, that's what I told you Dr. Silver did. And I would go with him. If he had to mimic an illness, he'd simply go find someone that's ill, sit and watch them, and then become that. There's an empath. Well, if there is the ability to do that empathetically for illness, you can do it for health also. You can do it for spiritual development also. If there's psychosomatic illness, then there's psychosomatic health. And what we're talking about here is you walk on the path of initiation described by other initiates, and if they match up to the signpost that you're seeing on your path, then it keeps pointing you in the right direction instead of the wrong direction. And so I'm going to read here a couple things so that you get this, what I didn't tell you. Well, I mentioned it last time, but I should clarify this. There are two very clear ways to meet Christ in the etheric right now in his second coming. Why? His first coming was in a physical body. His second coming is in an etheric body now. And it adds on to his pre-earthly deeds of Christ and the mystery of Golgotha. Remember, the pre-earthly deeds of Christ are that the human being can stand upright, speak, and think. And then the mystery of Golgotha gave us our I am so that we could control those three bodies, which are the physical, etheric, and astral body. And that is directly related to initiation. You go through the same process on a higher spiraling level, but in a redemptive fashion in so much of this. So when Paul, who had been the worst guy to the Christians, persecuting them, locking them up, killing them, and he was an initiate of the Hebrew mysteries and the Greek mysteries. So he was no fool. He was a high, incredible spiritual being, supposedly working on his moral development. But he thought that Christ being the Messiah in a physical body was wrong because he had been taught through the mystery schools that this being of the solar deity, the Logos, the Word, the Christ, was still coming to the earth, but certainly had not come to the earth and taken on a physical body in Jesus of Nazareth. So he was persecuting them. And he's on the way to Damascus to get permission to persecute some more of them. And he gets knocked off his horse by a blinding light and hears a voice. Oh, he hears sound and he hears a voice. And the voice says, "Why are you persecuting my followers?" And he's made blind. And he's blind until he's told then also go into the town of Damascus and seek out certain people. And then Ananias came and healed him and removed the scales from his eyes, because seeing the light of Christ was so blinding that he was blind until he was healed by Ananias in the name of Jesus Christ. So a quote from Rudolf Steiner from the Etherization of the Blood, which really, the etherization of the blood is the process of initiation. And if you want the clearest expose on that in the Western esoteric tradition, it would be Steiner's. So in the etherization of the blood, he says, ... the miraculous spiritualized fire, the Christ light, which was revealed to Paul on the road to Damascus in glorious divine revelation, will appear to others in the etheric clouds. The greatest mystery of our time is the second coming of Christ. In the next age, the Damascus event will come to life, implying it comes, of course, for everyone through that second coming of Christ. When once human beings are able to immerse their gaze into Shambhala, they will be able to understand the Gospels. They will need a kind of Damascus event. In other words, let me break this down for you. You need the experience of meeting the living Christ to be able to understand what's in the Bible. And the stories, the words, everything, the description of Christ, his life, his ministry. And what the other sentence above that is saying is that the Damascus event will give us the insight, basically the revelation, the initiation, the miraculous spiritualized fire, the Christ light. That's what we need. That's the same thing as the second coming of Christ. So there's not going to be one big second coming of Christ in the clouds. And as we hear in Acts, immediately I started with this description here that Christ left in the clouds, and then the angels appeared and said that's how he will return. So what is this in the clouds thing that is being talked about here? That's Christ in the etheric. And some human beings, through initiation, which is, by the way, a terrifying process of self-realization. And nothing is scarier than self-realization. Being told the truth about yourself will end your, in any friendship, right? If you tell the whole truth to somebody, right, you're just not going to do that, not here in the physical world. I don't recommend it. But if you try to carry anything like that into the spiritual world, you will be kicked out. So when you are ready, you can have the same experience that Paul had on the road to Damascus, the Damascus event, which will be your own personal initiation, which goes to underscore what we tell you in the Gospel of Sophia. You do not need a master, a priest, a priestess, a guru to initiate you. You can get initiated directly by Christ.
Absolutely. And in speaking of the subject that you were addressing just a little bit earlier about the target, about what is that missing of the target that they call sin. And then you get at the image of self that you have when crossing the threshold is really that which is needed to be overcome. And that's the golden calf. That's your sheath nature. That's you've dressed up and put whistles and bells on this big bag of stuff that you've been dragging with you, incarnation to incarnation. And what can you do to get to the point to where you can partake of creation out of nothingness? And that's to be actually free, to be able to enter into the realm of thought so that you have sense-free thinking, and it's clear and it's moral. And that's the difficult part. And so there's an old saying by Moses Maimonides. He was a rabbi. They call him Rabbi Rambam, and he wrote a guide to the perplexed. And it's a analysis of the Kabbalah, but in an Aristotelian fashion. And he says, to speak the truth of a man is to slander him.
So true. And you have to be an empty vessel, as we've spoken about before. Tibetan Buddhism says it very clear. Creation out of nothingness. What is nothingness? You think, oh, that's nothing. That's the void. That's nothing. No, it is the emptiness of space. It's the container of space, but there is no containment of space. So it's something that is one of those, what did I call it? A paradoxical logic. It's where you can't even comprehend it. But when you're 100% empty, you're like an empath. You're like I was as a child. You're empty. People say, what are you thinking about? And you go, nothing. You're quite serious. You've been thinking about nothing now, it seems, for hours. And you're quite content. Why? That's the highest state you can be in. It's they would call it theta. It's like a trance state, but you're awake, but you also have directed your consciousness somewhere. And so I would simply think about what it is I'm perceiving, which is enough to overwhelm anybody who's an empath and is clairvoyant, because just looking at a tree is enough to overwhelm you, because the wisdom coming through the light, interacting and turning a seed into a tree that's standing before you in this linear time manifestation, which is an illusion, is enough to knock you to the ground, okay, if you're conscious and you're awake. So there's two ways. You can either, like Jacob Burma, you have that golden moment of illumination, that light of the sun, like my dear beloved Tyla has had, that I'm hoping I can get her to talk about soon. But she saw light, and the light went in, and the light did what it's supposed to do. It awakened them, and it dispelled all darkness. Well, that's all darkness in your body. That is enough to create such a revelation and enlightenment and initiation that it takes the rest of your life to unpack it. So I'm going to tell you about some events here that any one of them should have been enough for a normal human being not to have the intervention of the spiritual world come again. Once should be enough. So there's the way of Paul, knocked to the ground, blinded, set into the right path, spoken to, so he saw light, he heard sound, he heard words. And that is exactly what I mentioned last time. But I'm going to give a bit of a fuller explanation after I point out that there's a second way for this to happen. And I wish to impose upon you by reading a quote from Rudolf Steiner from also the etherization of the blood. And this should be good for everyone who's suffering. And I need to do this so that you can understand what I'm about to explain to you about suffering. Attempt to explain. So Rudolf Steiner says, the Christ will become a living comforter. Many a human being will have this experience when sitting silent in his room, heavy-hearted and oppressed, not knowing which way to turn. The door will open, and the etheric Christ will appear and speak words of consolation to him. The Christ will become a living comforter to humans. Many a time when people, even in considerable numbers, are sitting together, not knowing what to do and waiting, they will see the etheric Christ. He will himself be there, will confer with them, will make his voice heard in such gatherings. These times are approaching, and this positive, constructive element will take real effect in the evolution of mankind. That's the other one. And I can tell you, I've experienced that, unfortunately, a number of times when I was at my end and praying very hard, and the comforter walked into the room. Sometimes you see the comforter, sometimes you don't. Having worked with Father William in the psych ward and in hospitals, people who went through near-death experiences, many of them, they would speak of this. They'd speak of someone who would walk in and do something, and no one had walked in. There was no human who had walked into the room. But this happens all the time now.
Well, you have that concept of the paraclete, and the paraclete is the comforter, isn't it? And so really what that is that company of saints and souls and great beings that are working on your behalf, even though you don't know it. But you have to help them by giving them the opportunity to work with you. And so that's the great peace, see, is when you find that great peace, which is that what they call in the East shunyata, or emptiness. The emptiness is not empty, it's a fullness. It's just that it's not being disrupted by your personal golden calf personality, that you allow it to be something, and by its being something, you will find something. But the path is a gradual path, and so gradali is Latin, and that's one way of looking at the name of the Grail, that there's this gradual path where you're fastening a vehicle to be able to bear that light, and that light that was held by the angels awaiting for the Grail King to come, right? So that's that whole idea of the mission of the Paraclete that works with this Christ experience, because there's the Christ, who's a cosmic being, and then there's the Paraclete stream, which is a result of earthly beings participating in that cosmic realm in a particular way. And so that gets into that whole mystery of the Sophia and the conjoining of Sophia, or wisdom, with love.
Absolutely. And Steiner has said that wisdom, from one point of view, is crystallized suffering. And so when you talk about Sophia, or the comforter of the Holy Spirit, or the comforter of Christ being the Holy Spirit, it's infinite. He said he would never go away. He'd be here until the end of time. Mother Mary basically has made that promise to us too, through all of her different visitations. So there's always someone in the spiritual world ready to help, whether it be a saint or a guru or a great master being, or an angel, your guardian angel, an archangel. There's always. What's the only thing keeping you from having it? What's the only thing keeping you from enlightenment, according to the Dzogchen and the Tibetan Buddhist approach to emptiness? Silencing your mind, silencing your selfishness, and having no attachment to the world. And then you go into emptiness, not a void. And that emptiness is more active than anything here in the material world, but it's completely empty because it's inside out, upside down and backwards. And so when we're talking about this, two different forums, this brilliant moment, golden moment of illumination, it's sometimes called enlightenment, sometimes it's called attaining the rainbow body. Sometimes the person who attains it turns into fire right in front of everyone's eyes, burns up, and leaves a pile of ashes. Sometimes a being comes from heaven and comes down and grabs them, usually by, I can't tell all the secrets, but there's a special way they get grabbed and taken into heaven and translated into heaven through Vajrayogini. Or the Ezekiel's chariot, the fiery wheels of heaven come down. All these different people saw it in the different archetypes that they were used to in relationship to the divine, but they are all describing the same thing: Christ descending into the clouds. All of these different things are, in fact, attaining vision of the etheric living realm, the living realm. Christ is living. You don't have to believe in someone who was in the past. You don't need any of that. You need to know that Christ is alive right now. He's your access to your higher self. Matter of fact, he's the template upon which your higher self was built. And someday we'll all go back to being a group soul of the higher, individualized higher selves, Christ and beings. And that will be a group soul, but still that's not Christ. Christ's above that. He's in the Trinity. So when we're talking about Christ, his capacities are infinite. He can appear to the apostles out of nowhere. He could walk through doors. He can take on the effect. I've told this story. Matter of fact, I should tell this before I get all serious and heavy. I've told this story before. You might have heard it, John. I'm with my sister, and I have a clairvoyant impression that my dad's car is not going to make it where my dad wants me to drive my sister in his car. And I say, Dad, your tires look really bad. You don't have a spare. I checked. They'll be fine. So we're driving down the highway, hours and hours from home. And of course, the tire blows out. Now we're nowhere. Have I told you this story before? And we're nowhere.
Yeah, but I don't remember all the details. And
It's so ridiculous. I still remind my sister of it. She still just goes into that state where you go, cognitive dissonance. Where you just go, don't tell me that story. I don't want to know it. I witnessed it. I don't want to know it. So the tire goes out. I don't have spare. I know it. No one's around. No houses are around. Instantaneously, my sister looks in the rearview mirror of her side and says, "Where'd that truck come from?" I get out. It's two hillbillies, like don't have teeth. They're wearing their, just total my kind of people, Ozark people, totally barely understand a word they say. Before I even get back there, they pulled out a hydraulic pump or a jack, pumped up the car, put a new tire on there. Where'd they get the new tire? And it fit, put it all down, and they're lowering it before I'm like still in shock. And finally I say, well, I should give you some money. And they just laughed at me and they said, our kind don't need money. They get in the car. I'm still in shock. I walk back. I get in the car. They're gone. Their truck's gone. I got a tire in the car that I didn't have. Everything's fixed. And my sister's going, what happened? Because she was like in some kind of time warp or something. She go, what happened? I said, I don't know what happened. It took me years to finally figure it out. Those were angels. And Rudolf Steiner says that Christ will literally come in the form of a human being, walk through, not walk through the door, open the door, walk in, put his hand on you, exactly as he allowed Thomas to feel the wounds in his hand. So he can take form. So that's one end. That's when you're at the lowest of the low and you're a good, moral, pious person and you really need help. And all you really need is a word of encouragement from the spiritual world. So what are you really saying? God, help me. And what are you really saying? Because you're doubting. Show me something, give me a blessing. You're begging for this. I know I've been in this condition a number of times. So that can happen, and that happens with Mary. All kinds of people have Mary come into their dreams, Mary come into the room, Mary come in and stand at the foot of their bed and wake them up. And it's been continuous with Mary since she was ascended into heaven. And it was for some people instantaneous that Saul, shortly after Christ's crucifixion and resurrection and ascension, he was able to appear to an initiate. Now, in the future, right now, people who are initiates can have that experience by going to the etheric world. People who are not initiates, who are just pious people, can have it by Christ coming and appearing to them. And so what I was describing is not some kind of bizarre abnormality that caused me to be the way that I was when I was young, which was insufferable, actually, but also to have certain capacities. But now I don't have those. And so, but I still have the thing that everyone has who has had either one of those events, 100% faith. Now, in today's age, Steiner says, in today's age, your head will feel like you've stuck your head in an antheap and there's millions of ants just going around and you can't control a thing. That's what he says is the proper modern attitude towards what the modern world in our time, and he predicted this for our time, because the spider web network is trying to draw you in and the supernatural forces are trying to get you. So evil's everywhere. And he says that the normal attitude that a human being will have is that they're overwhelmed by the fact that they see the evil and they can't counteract it. And he says there's only one cure for that: faith that Christ will. Not you, faith that Christ will.
Yeah, Rudolf Steiner is very clear, adamant, when he says that the adversaries, as formidable as they are, and I paraphrase, that Christ is infinitely more powerful than the adversaries. And so in taking refuge in Christ, which is essentially what you're doing, that gives you the armor of God. And they can't pierce that, because that realm is your realm. That realm is sacrosanct. And so that's the realm in which you participate with the Christ. And so don't worry, but be brave, because it's not easy.
It's terrible. When I was young, now here we get to the bad part, okay? You might find this completely distasteful. But some people, they think that they should, they idolize me sometimes when I was younger and I could do all these things. And they made me into one of their golden calves, one of their idols. No, I don't want to be anybody's idol ever, when I was young or now, certainly not now. But this is the way it happened. I was born completely aware of all these things, and I didn't speak, and I was considered to be retarded. And I couldn't go out into the sunlight without very, very dark glasses on. I couldn't go near an evergreen tree or most plants because my eyes would swell shut just by going near them. And then they would flake off like I had leprosy. And then I'd have leprosy all over my eyes and different parts of my body. And it was just horrifying to even sometimes look at me. And then I was so weak, it looked like I was weak, right? So basically, what was that? I was an empath. I just unfortunately didn't know how to put up any barriers to anything, and everything overwhelmed me. So I was allergic to everything from dust to dirt to whatever. So starting off as a child, I had an absolutely miserable life. Finally, I started learning martial arts when I was young, and that toughened me up, and I was able to do some of that. But when I was young, I think maybe 9 years old or 10 years old, unfortunately, everything would bother me: light, sound, words, the incongruency of people's thoughts, feelings, and their doing, that they would say one thing and do something else. That drove me nuts. That someone was in pain. If they were in pain, I was in pain. To see an animal in pain, oh, I was completely in the same pain. I would literally become that pain, just like Dr. Silverwood. I didn't know how to control that. And on a very regular basis, I would be just standing there and I'd be knocked to the ground because I would hear the spinning of the earth. And it would be terrifying. Now you think that's a crazy person. Yeah, and I guess you had little friends who followed you around. Yeah, that too. But those are elementals, and I wasn't friends with elementals. I knew my place. I was friends with angels. So I saw the war in heaven. It was happening all the time. It was always raging. When I was awake in the daytime, I was in a dream. When I was in sleep in a dream, I was awake. And I would go through what Damascus calls exomatosis. Every night, if I had surplus energy and I was awake in my dreams, I would be called to participate in acts of going and helping heal people, situations, the land, all kinds of things. Whatever was on the agenda for that night, they call in people who are awake in their dreams and they use them. And so I was busy. So in the daytime, I was always very tired and very sleepy and wanted to just curl up in the dark, in a dark room, and get away from the sounds. Because the sounds that I would hear, I didn't know when I was young that nobody else heard those sounds. I constantly heard birds chirping, crickets, flutes, buzzing, ringing, words. People, I would hear voices speaking to me. I thought all that was normal. Everybody had that. So I just shut up and I was listening all the time, because wherever I'd go, if I'd walk in a room, the nature of the room would create a sound, and I would just listen to the sound. When I'd walk up to a person, they would usually be in disharmony, except for children. adults were usually in disharmony. And you could look at them and their body is producing this wave, and it's either harmonious or it's disharmonious. And then when they spoke to you, oh boy, then that was just like, might as well have been spears coming out of their mouth or a sword stabbing me. And words had very, very, very powerful effect upon me. And so I didn't speak, and I was kind of had speech problems and this and that. Because why? I didn't really want to integrate with the physical world. As a matter of fact, I prayed constantly that I would be taken into these other worlds that I could see. So I would fall to the ground, I'd hear the earth spinning, and then that got deeper over time. And I was introduced to a being who now I know Rudolf Steiner calls the being of this periodicity of time, a being who sits at the North Pole and measures out the rotation of the earth. Well, that being was a friend of mine, because I'd have to ask that being if he could please teach me how to stand upright while the spinning of the earth should knock anyone down. And what was Christ's pre-earthly deed, his first one? To teach humans how to stand upright. I literally didn't fully understand how to stand upright. And many times I'd just be knocked to the ground and feel this, and it makes you want to vomit. And it's a terrifying thing. And then what usually accompanied it was sound, horrible, horrible, dissonant sounds. Later it turned into harmonies because I understood what it was. And then later words. So always there would be some kind of, it was like a command. But when this, what I call now the word of life, it's the life ether, it's the word of Christ, it's the Logos, would speak and tell me something like, you're okay, stand upright, the spinning will stop, or something like that. And I'd follow what the word told me, and it would work in every case. Why? Because the words were me doing it at the same time. And intuition is when the word of Christ becomes a deed and the divine will and the human will becomes one at one time. That is what the word is. That's the word of life, as I call it. And that's what would speak to me. And so from a child, from age 9 on and on, every time I'd get knocked to the ground or I'd get knocked out or I was allergic to everything. I have massive migraine headaches that would last for days and all this kind of horrible thing I have now, thousands of tumors in my body. Throughout my whole life, I have horrible things happening. Most of them, they would say, no one's going to recover from this. So, we don't give him much hope. I was a terrible sleepwalker. I would get up on the top of the house, get up on the roof of the house while I'm sleepwalking. If I would have fallen, I would have died. I would talk all the time in my sleep, so much so that nobody could be near me when I'd sleep. I would get up, do weird things. I'd do things while I was awake, and I was in a dream. I didn't even know I was doing them. And I was constantly used as a voice for the word, or what I thought was the word. Now I know that light that comes, that's the angelic body of Christ through his pre-earthly deeds. And then there's the sound that is the archangelic body of Christ through his pre-earthly deeds. And the word is another of his 3 pre-earthly deeds. And I know that being that he worked through to manifest that, Rudolf Steiner calls the Nathan soul. For those of you who are anthroposophists, it doesn't matter. It's Christ. So you can see these angels, archangels, and archai. But when you do, you better be ready to be terrified. You better be ready to have your body ripped into pieces, to want to, I don't know how to do it. You say it. You vomit until you turn inside out. And what is the spiritual world? It's inside out. Well, that's exactly what you do. And you go blind and you go deaf. So what is that? Standing upright is the force of Christ, the force of the Son, your ego. Speech is us trying to replicate the harmony of the spheres. In other words, the speech of the planets, and which is in your organs. And then what is this thinking that is a third capacity that Christ gave us? That's the moon and the beings between here and the moon that you can commune with, the angels, the archangels, all the beings, particularly the angels between here and the moon. So I noticed now when I look back upon that this is simply being deaf, dumb, and blind. And you are awakened. And so Paul was made deaf, dumb, and blind. You were knocked to the ground. You can't see. You need to retune your eyes, retune your ears, retune your heart, and your willpower so that it's focused on the good and the true, the beautiful, and the good. And that what I went through was not, it was a Damascus event, but for some reason, I think it must have been, and I'm only saying this now, I've never said this before, I imagine that it was replicating some initiation that I had. And that's the reason that I could have it. Why? Because Paul had an initiation, both in the Hebrew and the Greek initiation schools, the mystery schools. And that's why he was able to have that experience, though he was, in fact, crucifying, killing Christians. He was chosen to be the mouthpiece of Christianity, which some people say without Paul, there'd be no Christianity. So it shows that no matter what you are doing, how bad you think you are, it isn't about good works. It isn't about anything you deserve. When you're in that depressed state, you're sitting alone in your room, and Christ or Mary comes in, the Sophia comes in, and they lay their hand on your head or your shoulder, and all of a sudden you're healed. It isn't because you deserved it. That's what I want to tell you. It's because they love you, and it's their grace and their mercy. It's nothing you deserved. And so I'm trying to tell you, being clairvoyant as I was, clairaudient, clairsentient, was, I think, nothing I deserved. It was simply given, and I believe that it can be given to anybody.
Yeah, if you just make a list of all the bad things about you, that's essentially what you deserve. And what Douglas is talking about is above and beyond all of that, that, that we're not even capable of rising to the level of deserving this type of redemption, that this is an act of grace from the divine spiritual world. And if you look at Jesus Christ, who did he hang out with? I mean, he hung out with a bunch of, the wrong people, the wrong sort of people, as they would say over in the Sanhedrin or wherever, And so when you look at an individual like Paul, see, there's a subtle distinction because you have people that have been initiates in other lifetimes. And so when they come to this world again, they meet with events that tap into something that happened in the distant past in a previous incarnation, maybe numerous incarnations. It's all unique. But when you get to someone like Paul, who has that, but is also initiated within two particular mystery streams currently. Okay, so that's a difference between somebody who was an initiate in another life and an initiate in this life. And so when you have Saul, who couldn't accept it, that the great event had happened as of yet, and then he's struck blind and knocked off the horse in Damascus, and then receives his vision back through Ananias, you have this whole incredible story of coming to a realization that was capable of going beyond just being a Hebrew revelation, that he had the tools and the capacities to be able to take the message of Christ out into the world, into the Greek-speaking world, because he spoke Koinoid Greek, and he also knew Hebrew, and he could communicate with these people. And what's so interestingly unique about St. Paul, and so remember before we said there's 4 gospels and there's 4 fundamental approaches that went out from what we could call the school of Jesus Christ, that those 4 gospels are the principal viewpoints, but yet there's this 5th one. And that's fascinating because St. Paul, he's really like quite a firebrand, actually, when he gets into some people and criticizing what they're doing. He's definitely a warrior. There's no question about that. And so when you look at what he did and the legacy that he left mankind, being that he helped train Saint Mark, right? I mean, he hadn't even met Jesus Christ, and yet he's training one of their group. So he's a formidable being. And then starting the great school in Athens, the first bishop of Athens, Dionysius, and The only other Damaris, the woman that's with Dionysius, that great woman of which we know nearly nothing. You have to understand that St. Paul had so much to give that he could integrate the message of Christ with other people's. And so you'll find within the Christian tradition festivals that were set up. And when you research them, you realize that it was a continuation of a festival they were already doing. They just reconfigured it to meet the message of Christ. And it's really a humbling experience when you realize how great of an individual St. Paul was.
You asked me to speak on my own experience. I've already done that. And so at the bottom of the article, and it's an excellent article, the quotes that you've pulled from Steiner, I wish I had way back in the day. I had my experience before I ever came to anthroposophy. So that was in a testament to what you just said, that you don't have to have some religious belief to be there and have this experience. Anyway, I put my recording of that at the bottom of the article. But it's interesting when you talk about evil. And we look around in the world today, and I cannot imagine how much more evil we have to see and what's going to be done about it. And no individual human can do anything other than pray, because it's demonic. It's beyond time and space. It's multi-generational. It's gone through the millennia. It's just awful. And so there is great comfort in realizing that you put your faith in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is who will take out this evil, not us. So thank you.
Thank you. And by the way, I highly endorse the podcast that she just described being in the show notes. That was of her experience. So if you want to hear about her experience, and her experience is different a bit than mine, but it's the same. And it's probably what drew us together, and it's what kept us together, and it's what's driven us to write and do all the work that we've done together. Because once you have this experience, as Tyler always likes to say, it takes the rest of your life to unpack it. So I can tell you that as a child, the wisdom that I was given by witnessing this light, this sound, this word has sustained me to this moment. And there's no way that my faith can ever be shaken. Even when I was on dialysis, even when I was having heart attacks, even when they've told me that I was going to die from neurofibromatosis and from all the other illnesses and from the tumors in my head, all this stuff. Literally, John, how many times have they told me I was going to die? I have died literally 3 times, but they've told me a dozen other times I'm going to die. And I'm like, oh, okay, that'll be fine. Because as a child, I would pray to die because I didn't want to be here. And now I do want to be here. So
that's the story of Humpty Dumpty, isn't it? Except that this Humpty Dumpty gets put back together again. And I've sat back and watched this drama go on since I've known this man. And I can assure you, he's telling the truth. And it's absolutely amazing the way in which he's got himself so far beneath the horizon. And then all of a sudden you see him a couple weeks later, and it's as if it had all moved on. And he goes to the doctors, and they go, well, I don't know what happened, but you're fine. And they'll start taking out tubes and stuff like that and say, well, you're fine, go home. You got to love that. And of course, I know the real secret reason is that he had work to do with Tyler and work with myself and other people. But that when you're a warrior, it doesn't do as much good if you're not here to be able to function in that capacity. And so he's a true warrior, and I'm honored to be his friend.
Well, I keep looking for another quote and never been able to find it again. It was Nietzsche who said, and why he said this, I have no idea. But he makes a reference to Sophia. And he goes, Sophia is not looking for weak people. Sophia is looking for warriors who will charge into the battle with soldiers falling to the left and right. And when the banner falls, will lunge forward, pick up the banner, and charge forward. It's like, Nietzsche said that?
That's funny. So, look, when I was a girl growing up in the South, you would have your debut. You'd be a debutante, and my father was really pushing me to be a debutante. I said, I'd rather be a Dionysian, Zarathustrian warrior. And there you have it. It's what I've become.
She is, folks. Let me tell you. And If I don't lunge forward and pick up the banner, she gets really mad at me. So that's the only reason I'm probably still alive, as John has pointed out, that there's more work to do, because the work of the second coming of Christ, the work of what Rudolf Steiner called the current Buddha, who's a bodhisattva, who's growing from a bodhisattva into a Buddha, called the Maitreya Buddha, the work of one of the highest spiritual masters is simply to explain who Christ is. And then people will have the opportunity to have the direct experience. But if they believe that Christ is Jesus, or the different illnesses that Rudolf Steiner describes connected to Jesusology and Jesusism and Jesus as a man and all the different illnesses that try to make Jesus a man, that's the reason that when I speak, I will be very clear whether I'm speaking of Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, or Christ Jesus, or Christ. And you need to understand the cosmic Christ. And so the deal is, just as you said, Paul was this fiery warrior. You can't withstand an experience of an angel, an archangel, an archai, let alone an Elohim, Christ acting through the Elohim, a son being, the Logos, without dissolving all your connection to the physical world. You can't bring selflessness there. It will burn you up. And so Paul was burnt up. And that's the reason that Steiner refers to it as the miraculous spiritualizing fire, the Christ light. The miraculous spiritualizing fire. In other words, when you see this fire, this light, and it's not like no light, it acts like a fluid, but it acts like a cloud. It looks exactly like a cloud, literally, but 3 levels, and then a 4th level. And the 4th level, there's no way you can look at it. There's no way you could look directly on the etheric Christ. You can look through your astral body, through your astral light, through your guardian angel. You're able to look at the current manifestation of the pre-earthly deeds of Christ. In other words, standing upright, speaking, and thinking. So if you could understand those 3 elements all at once and understand where your ego came from, which is directly from the Elohim, from Christ, and where it's going to, which is directly back to the Elohim through Christ, you would burn up. You would instantaneously burn up. And what is it that they try to teach you in initiation? You have to be ready to die. As a matter of fact, it is a ritual death. And in some cases, it's through the different elements. You'll go through, earth, water, fire, air, as the different baptisms. In other words, the different bodies that you have that need to be purified. This is the language of the Spirit. That's why in the 3rd volume of the Gospel of Sophia, we do something quite interesting. Why is it interesting? Because we stole it from the past. We stole it from the best. Whether it be the Tarot, 22 letters of the Tarot, the 22 letters of the Proto-Hebraic language, whether it be the 22 letters of eurythmy, the 22 formative forces of the consonants of the zodiac, or whether it be the 7 forces of the planets, these are all the forces of initiation that are in your body that you can gear towards separating your astral body from your etheric body, and consciously. And when you do, you become an objective viewer of the most magnificent thing you'll ever experience, your own etheric body. That alone will be the overwhelming factor that would drive anyone into unconsciousness, into the void, into a lack of, into trance consciousness. But if you can stay awake as you do that, in every case, it matters not what religion, as Tyler just said, it matters not what religion you are. You're going to see your higher self. You're going to see Christ. And when you do, it's going to change your life permanently. And it will be the spiritualizing fire of initiation. That's the point. If you want initiation, you can take the language of the Spirit, which are 22 letters that make up a language. Now, those letters are going to have a moral intent to them. They're going to have wisdom to them. They're going to have beauty to them. So we took 22 sayings from the world's greatest religions, from Christ also, and put them there so that people can say, I will have all these choices of the language of Spirit, because the language of the Spirit on the other side, in the Spirit land, is certainly not the language of words. It's the language of deeds. Everything's a deed there. Everything is a willpower there. So there's no such thing as a casual thought, a fantasy. No, there's no such thing. Everything there is as real can be, but completely the opposite of down here. So when you get the language of the Spirit, then you not only can hear, and the harmony of the spheres, the hearing part, will turn from dissonance into harmony as you develop through your own path of initiation through morality. You'll learn the language of the Spirit, and the language of the Spirit can make you able to not only hear the Spirit, but also speak with the Spirit. And that's what Paul did throughout all of his letters, throughout his epistles, and throughout all of his teachings. And that's what John the Divine did with the Apocalypse. It is learning to hear the Spirit speak and learning to commune with them, to have communication with them. And when you come back, just like the Maitreya Buddha, just like Sophia, what are you going to speak about? The wisdom of the cosmic Christ.
Yes, in the Principle of Spiritual Economy, Rudolf Steiner says, and that's Collected Works, Volume 109, it was perceived again when Saul opened his eyes on his way to Damascus, found that they had become illumined and clairvoyant, and recognized in the heavenly fire the one who'd accomplished the mystery of Golgotha. Both Saul, who became Paul, and Moses saw the Christ. And in the festivals and their meaning, he says, and I quote, "It was seen again when the eyes of Saul, illumined by clairvoyance on the road to Damascus, beheld and recognized in the radiance of heavenly fire the one who had fulfilled the mystery of Golgotha. And so both Moses and Paul beheld the Christ. Moses beheld him in the material fire in the burning thorn bush and in the lightning on Sinai. But only inwardly could he be made aware that it was the Christ who spoke with him." And so you have this culmination of this Moses realization where he could see the Christ, but it was working in nature. It was approaching him in the burning bush, and there's the column of smoke, and there's the lightning, and all of these revelations of the Christ working through the sphere of the Elohim. But when Christ goes through the mystery of Golgotha, it becomes an awakening, not just for humanity, but for the literal, celestial hierarchies themselves. We're able to have the experience of the Logos, that high sun being, coming to earth and manifesting in a human form, and then taking that human form and bringing it through the ascension, the resurrection, and the whole process that is so vividly described in Scripture and elaborated on so extensively by Rudolf Steiner. And so that's so much food for thought. And this is really, I'm really humbled by this event, by the way. And it's when you start to realize things that you knew, that it comes renewed, and you know it more and you know it deeper as time goes on. And so it's to be able to hold certain content so that throughout the day you can bring yourself back and reorient yourself so that you're aware that this is a process that you're going through gradually. And so with that, I want to thank Tyler Gabriel for being the motivating force, the will behind this whole thing. And I want to thank Dr. Gabriel for being so forthcoming as to his path to truth. And I want to thank everybody else for coming by to see what we had to say. God bless.